My chest felt tight the moment I walked through that front door. Not the kind of tight you get from a long drive or a stressful day at work, the kind that tells you something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. I just didn't know yet how wrong it truly was. My name doesn't matter much for this story. What matters is that for 31 years, I worked as a licensed clinical social worker specializing in family trauma. I sat across from hundreds of people who had been broken by the ones who claimed to love them. I knew the patterns. I knew the language. I knew the silence that follows a slap better than most people know their own reflection. And yet, I missed it. In my own home, with my own son. That is something I will carry for the rest of my life. My son, I'll call him Daniel, was 34 when he married his wife. I'll call her Renee. She was bright, sharp-tongued in a way some people find charming, and she had this way of walking into a room like she already owned it. When Daniel brought her home the first time, she shook my hand firmly, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "I've heard so much about you. Daniel talks about you constantly." I liked her immediately. That was my first mistake. They met at a conference. Both worked in project management, though for different companies. Within 8 months they were engaged. Within 14 months they were married. I remember thinking it was fast, but Daniel was 34, not 22, and he was steady and calm, and I trusted his judgment. His mother, my late wife Margaret, had passed 4 years before the wedding, and I think a part of me was just grateful to see him happy. Grateful enough that I stopped watching closely. Renee had a brother. I'll call him Marcus. He was 3 years older than her, divorced, loud in the way that fills every corner of a room without actually saying anything worth hearing. He came to the wedding, made a toast that was more about himself than Daniel or Renee, and then inserted himself into their lives with a frequency I should have questioned much sooner. He would show up unannounced at their house. He would call Renee 4-5 times in a single evening. When Daniel would make a decision where to vacation, which car to buy, whether to refinance their home, Marcus always had an opinion, delivered through Renee, who would then deliver it to Daniel as if it were her own. I watched this happen twice before I told myself it was just a close sibling relationship. People have those. Margaret and her sister had been the same way. I told myself that too. The first sign I truly registered, though I buried it at the time, came about a year into their marriage. Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. He typically called on weekends. His voice was flat in a way I recognized professionally but refused to apply personally. He said he and Renee had argued. He said she had told him that his friends from college were pulling him backward, that spending time with them was immature, and that a married man should prioritize his wife and their future. He laughed a little when he told me. Said he thought she had a point. I said, "Do you think she has a point?" He paused a second too long. "Yeah," he said, "probably." I let it go. I should not have let it go. By their second anniversary, Daniel had stopped going to his Tuesday night basketball pickup games. He stopped attending the annual camping trip he had taken every September since he was 26. His college friends, 4 men he had known for over a decade, gradually stopped calling because the calls were never returned. When I asked Daniel about it once, he told me he had just outgrown that chapter. He said it like he was reading from a script he had memorized. Renee was always perfectly pleasant to me. That is the detail I want people to understand. She was never rude to my face. She was never cold or dismissive or overtly hostile. She remembered my birthday. She sent me a card on the anniversary of Margaret's passing every year, handwritten, always a different thoughtful line. She asked about my health. She called me by my first name, Richard, in a warm, familiar tone. In a room full of people, she was the picture of a devoted daughter-in-law. But she had a way of making Daniel smaller when she thought no one important was watching. A small correction when he was telling a story. "That's not how it happened, Daniel." A sigh when he offered an opinion at dinner. A look exchanged with Marcus when Daniel said something she disagreed with. A look that said, "Can you believe this?" without a single word. Small things, individually meaningless, collectively devastating. Daniel started apologizing for things that did not require apologies. He would apologize for suggesting a restaurant she didn't want. He would apologize for being 5 minutes late getting ready. He would apologize, once, in front of me, for having forgotten to confirm a reservation that she had told him she would handle. She accepted each apology with a gracious nod, like a teacher accepting a student's correction. I noticed. I filed it away. I told myself I was a professional who saw trauma patterns everywhere, and that I was projecting. I told myself that every marriage has its dynamic, and that it wasn't my place. I was wrong about all of it. The birthday party was my idea. Daniel turned 37 in early October, and I offered to host a small gathering at my house. Dinner, his cousins, a few neighbors, nothing large. Renee agreed immediately, enthusiastically, even, and offered to help with the food. I thought that was generous. I said yes. What I didn't know then was that Marcus had decided he was co-hosting. He arrived an hour before the other guests with Renee, which I hadn't expected. He walked in and began rearranging things. Not asking. Rearranging. He moved the chairs in my dining room. He told me my playlist was too quiet and connected his own phone to my speaker. He opened my refrigerator, looked at the food I had prepared, and said to Renee, within earshot of me, "Did he make the pasta himself?" You can always tell. Then he laughed. I said nothing. It was Daniel's birthday. I wanted the evening to be easy. Daniel arrived at 6:30. He looked tired, a tiredness I had been noticing more over the past several months, a particular kind of tired that doesn't come from work. He hugged me at the door and said the house looked great. Renee kissed him on the cheek and then told him he should have worn the blue shirt instead. "I told you this morning," she said. Not unkindly, just as fact. "You're right," Daniel said. "Sorry." We sat down to dinner around 7. 8 people at the table, me, Daniel, Renee, Marcus, my brother and his wife, and 2 neighbors who had known Daniel since he was a teenager. The food was good, the conversation was easy. For about 40 minutes, it felt like exactly what a birthday dinner should be. Then Daniel poured himself a glass of wine. He leaned over to refill Renee's glass at the same time, and his elbow caught the edge of his own glass. It tipped. A small amount of red wine spilled across the white tablecloth, maybe 6 inches of spread, and a few drops reached the sleeve of Renee's blouse. Not drenched, not ruined. A few drops on the sleeve. Renee looked at her sleeve. Then she looked at Daniel. "Seriously?" she said. The table got quiet. The particular quiet that happens when everyone senses something. "I'm so sorry," Daniel said immediately. He reached for his napkin. "Here, let me—" "Don't." She pulled her arm back. Her voice was controlled but hard. "You always do this. Every single time there's something important. It was an accident. It doesn't matter." She stood up, picked up her clutch, and said to the table, "Excuse me," and walked toward the bathroom. Marcus watched her go. Then he looked at Daniel, and he laughed. Not a quiet, uncomfortable laugh. A full, open laugh. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Man, you cannot catch a break." He shook his head like it was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. Daniel's face did something I will never forget. It didn't get angry. It didn't get defensive. It just went flat. Still, like a light being turned off from behind the eyes. He set down his napkin. He looked at the spill on the tablecloth. He said quietly, "Yeah." I was sitting 4 feet away from my son. I had spent 3 decades teaching other families how to recognize that exact moment, the moment when a person accepts cruelty as deserved. And watching it happen to Daniel, at his own birthday table, in my own dining room, something in me went absolutely still. Renee came back 2 minutes later. She sat down. She didn't look at Daniel. She picked up her fork and rejoined the conversation as if nothing had happened. Marcus followed her lead. The table awkwardly restarted. My neighbor, God bless her, made a comment about the weather, and everyone gratefully followed. But I didn't follow. I sat there and I counted backward. The canceled friendships, the apologizing, the tiredness, the look between Renee and Marcus. The way Daniel had said "yeah" like a man who had already lost an argument he didn't know he was in. After dinner, when the other guests moved to the living room, I found a moment in the kitchen alone with Daniel. I asked him simply, "Are you okay?" He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. And I'm telling you that not as a cliche but as a clinical observation, the facial muscles around his eyes did not engage. "Yeah, Dad," he said. "She's just stressed about a work thing. It's fine." "Daniel." "Dad, please. Tonight's been really nice. Don't make it a thing." I looked at my son for a long moment. Then I nodded. "Okay," I said. "Okay." I did not make it a thing that night. But I made a decision that night. What I did not tell Daniel, what I did not tell anyone, was that 3 weeks earlier, he had called me at 11 at night. He had been out of breath in a way that wasn't physical. He told me Renee, and he had gotten into an argument about money, about a transfer from their joint account that he had made without telling her first. He said she had screamed at him. He said Marcus had been at the house and had stood in the hallway listening and said nothing to stop it. He said after she finished screaming, she had picked up his laptop from the kitchen table and thrown it onto the tile floor. He said he had cleaned up the pieces in silence while she and Marcus sat in the living room watching television. He made me promise not to tell anyone. He said it wasn't that serious. He said he understood why she was upset. I promised. But I started documenting. Dates, times, what Daniel told me. His exact words. Because 31 years of this work teaches you that when someone tells you it isn't serious, and then lists the details in a voice that is utterly without anger, only exhaustion, it is already serious. It has been serious for longer than anyone wants to admit. Over the next 6 weeks after the birthday dinner, I did 3 things. The first thing I did was call a colleague, one of the best family law attorneys I had worked alongside over the years, a woman I trusted completely. I did not tell her Daniel knew I was calling. I asked her, hypothetically, what documentation would be most useful if a situation escalated. She walked me through it without asking too many questions, because she had worked with me long enough to know I didn't call hypothetically. The second thing I did was have a direct conversation with Daniel, not about Renee, about himself. I asked him when he had last done something purely because he wanted to, not what Renee wanted, not what would keep the peace, what he wanted. He looked at me like I had asked him something in a foreign language. He said, I want her to be happy. I said, that wasn't my question. He didn't answer. But he didn't leave the conversation either, and that told me something. The third thing I did was wait. Not passively. I waited the way you wait when you know something is coming and you need it to arrive on record rather than in memory. It came on a Saturday in November. Daniel had invited me to their house for lunch. Just the 3 of us. Renee had suggested it, apparently, which surprised me but shouldn't have. I arrived at noon. The house was clean. The food was good. Renee was in excellent spirits. Marcus was not there, which felt like a small relief. We were finishing lunch when Daniel's phone lit up on the table. A name I didn't recognize. Daniel glanced at it and said, That's Greg, you remember, from the old camping trip? He's in town, wanted to grab coffee this afternoon. Would that be all right? He asked her permission, at his own lunch. To see an old friend for coffee. Renee's expression didn't change. Her voice didn't rise. She said, You told me we were spending the afternoon together. We've been together all morning, and I was just thinking, so you made plans without asking me. It wasn't plans, he just texted. It doesn't matter how it came in, Daniel. She set down her fork. You don't even see it. This is exactly what I mean. I was going to ask you. Were you? She turned and looked at him with a directness that had something cold underneath it. Because it looks like you were going to ask for forgiveness, not permission. It looks like you already wanted to go. Daniel put his phone face down on the table. You're right, he said. I'll tell him another time. Renee looked at him one more moment. Then she turned to me and smiled and said, More coffee, Richard? I said yes. And beneath the table, I pressed the record button on my phone. What followed over the next 40 minutes was not one large event. It was a series of small, precise diminishments. A comment about a decision Daniel had made at work. You should have pushed back, but that's never really been your strength. A reference to a vacation they had taken 2 years ago. I spent the whole trip managing everything because Daniel can't handle logistics. Each statement delivered pleasantly, as if it were simple fact being shared between friends. Each one landing on Daniel like something he had already accepted as true. He didn't argue. He nodded. He said, Yeah, that's fair. He said, I know. I should have handled it better. I sat there. I kept my face calm. I kept the phone steady in my lap. At 1:45, Renee's phone rang. She looked at it and said, It's Marcus, I need to take this. She stepped out to the back porch. In the 30 seconds she was gone, I looked at my son. I said, I love you. You know that. He looked surprised by the timing. I know, Dad. I love you too. I need you to hear me. What I'm about to say isn't an attack on your marriage. It's a question from a man who has spent his career sitting with people in pain. I kept my voice low and steady. Daniel, is she hurting you? He didn't say no immediately. That pause, 2, maybe 3 seconds, was its own answer. Dad, you don't have to answer now, but I need you to know I see it, and I need you to know there are options, there is help, and whatever you decide, I am on your side. The back door opened. Renee came back in. She looked between us and smiled. Everything okay in here? Perfect, I said. What happened over the following 2 weeks happened faster than I expected. I shared the recordings with my attorney colleague. Not just the lunch, but the documented notes I had been keeping since October, the account of the laptop, the evening phone calls. She listened carefully. She told me that while audio recordings in our state were single-party consent and admissible, more significantly, the pattern of coercive control I had documented was consistent with legal definitions of domestic abuse that went beyond physical violence. She asked me if Daniel knew. I told her he was beginning to know, because in those 2 weeks I had 2 more conversations with my son. The second one, he cried. Not dramatically. Daniel is not a dramatic man, but the kind of quiet, surprised crying that happens when someone finally says aloud the thing they have been crushing inside for years. He said he didn't know when he had stopped feeling like himself. He said he thought it was just how marriage was. He said he was scared. I told him being scared was the right response to a situation that warranted fear. I told him that was not weakness. I told him that recognizing it was the bravest thing he had done in years. He asked me what he should do. I told him I had already made a call. Actually, 2 calls. One to my attorney colleague and one to a therapist. I trusted a man who specialized in male survivors of coercive control, because that population is underserved and frequently dismissed, and my son was not going to fall through that particular crack. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You already did all that?" 3 weeks ago, I said. He let out a breath. It was the first full breath I had heard from him in what felt like years. The next part of this story is not mine to tell in detail because it belongs to Daniel. What I can tell you is that he chose to take the steps that needed to be taken. He met with my colleague. He began working with the therapist. The legal process was careful and deliberate and documented. The recordings, the notes, the account of the destroyed laptop, which Daniel himself was finally willing to report, built a picture that was clear and thorough. Renee had retained her own attorney by then. Marcus, who had fancied himself someone with leverage, found that the leverage he thought he had was considerably less impressive when viewed through a legal lens. He had been in that house. He had witnessed incidents and said nothing. That was documented too. I am not going to tell you justice was perfect. It rarely is. The legal process is slow and exhausting, and it cost my son financially, emotionally, in time and sleep, and the kind of grief that comes with accepting that someone you loved chose to harm you. There is no clean ending to something like this. But Daniel has his Tuesday nights back. He went on the camping trip this past September for the first time in 3 years. He called me from somewhere in the mountains, and the signal was bad, and he was laughing about something one of his friends had done with a camp stove, and I sat in my kitchen, and I didn't say anything for a moment because I was listening to the sound of my son laughing without looking over his shoulder. He asked me if I was still there. I said, "I'm here." People sometimes ask me, colleagues, former clients, people who hear a version of this story, how I missed it for so long in my own family when I had spent decades being trained to see it. And I tell them the honest answer, which is that love distorts the lens, not in the way people assume, not by making you blind, but by making you want, desperately, for the thing you're seeing to be something other than what it is. Every sign I saw, I placed a more comfortable interpretation over it because the alternative required action that would cost my son pain. What I know now, more than I knew in 31 years of clinical work, is this. The cost of waiting is always higher than the cost of acting early. Always. Every single time. The first incident, wherever and whatever it is not a warning. It is the pattern announcing itself. It is the whole story in miniature. And the only question after that is not whether it will continue, but how long you will allow it to before you make the call. I made my call in October. I wish I had made it sooner. I am telling you this from my kitchen on a Tuesday evening. In about an hour, Daniel is going to call me the way he does most weeks now, and we will talk about ordinary things, his job, a book one of us is reading, whatever is happening in the news. And at the end of the call, he will say, "Love you, Dad," the way he always has, but it sounds different now, lighter, like a man who has remembered who he is. That is the only victory I needed. If you are watching this and something in this story landed somewhere specific in your chest, stay with that. That feeling is telling you something. And if you have someone in your life who seems smaller than they used to be, who apologizes too much, who laughs a little too quickly at their own expense, watch closely. Ask the quiet question. Be the person who is paying attention, because sometimes that's all it takes to change what comes next. Thank you for being here. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment. And if this story meant something to you, please share it. Someone in your life might need to hear it today.